Some rulers are born into power. Others fight for it. But only a few are seen as gods. In the ancient highlands of Ethiopia, where kingdoms clashed and empires crumbled, one man would rise above them all. A man who would defy invaders, command the respect of world leaders, and inspire a global movement that would outlive his reign. His name was Haile Selassie. To his people, he was a warrior, a reformer, the Lion of Judah. To his enemies, he was an unshakable force, standing against the tide of colonization and oppression. And to millions across the world, he was something even greater, a divine ruler, a Messiah, a living God. He walked among kings and emperors, yet his voice echoed far beyond royal halls. He stood before the League of Nations and warned the world of the dangers to come. He survived exile, reclaimed his throne, and ruled Ethiopia for over 4 decades. But power is never without its cost. His reign saw great victories, but also deep betrayals. His people worshipped him until they turned against him. He built a modern Ethiopia, but some say he ruled it like a god, beyond question, beyond challenge. In the end, the very empire he fought to protect would rise up and cast him down. Who was Haile Selassie? A visionary leader or a ruler clinging to power? A liberator or an emperor unwilling to change? A god or just a man? To understand the legend, we must go back to a time before the throne, before the war, before he was Haile Selassie. This is the story of a king. This is the story of an empire. This is the story of Ethiopia's last emperor. Before he was Haile Selassie, before he was emperor, before the world would call him a living god, he was Tafari Makanina, child born into nobility, yet destined for something far greater. He was born on the 23rd of July, 1892, in the mountain city of Ejersa Goro, Ethiopia. His father, Ras Makanin, was a powerful general and close advisor to Emperor Menelik II, one of Ethiopia's greatest rulers. His mother, Yeshimebet Ali, came from royal lineage. From the moment he took his first breath, Tafari was surrounded by power, ambition, and the weight of expectation. Ethiopia was unlike any other African nation. It had never been fully colonized. It was a land of kings and warriors, of rich traditions and deep spiritual beliefs. It was a country that had stood against European invaders and won, a symbol of resistance in a world where Africa was being carved up by foreign powers. But even within this proud empire, power was fragile. The nobility was divided, and the future of Ethiopia was uncertain. Tafari was different from other children of the nobility. While many boys of his status focused on physical strength and military training, he was drawn to something else: knowledge. He had an insatiable hunger for learning. His father ensured he received an elite education, and by the time he was a teenager, he could speak multiple languages, including Amharic, French, and later, English. This was rare for Ethiopian rulers, and it would set him apart. While other children played, Tafari studied. He read about history, law, governance, and diplomacy. He was fascinated by the outside world, by European politics, by the changing tides of power. He understood that Ethiopia could not remain isolated forever. If it was to survive, it had to modernize, it had to change. But knowledge alone does not make a king. Power is never given, it must be taken. And young Tafari knew that one day, his time would come. In 1906, when Tafari was just 14, his father, Ras Makanin, died suddenly. The man who had guided him, who had prepared him for leadership, was gone. Many believed that without his father's influence, Tafari would fade into the background. But they were wrong. Tafari was not just the son of a noble. He was a strategist, a thinker, a man who knew how to play the game of power, and his moment was coming. In 1910, at just 18 years old, he was appointed governor of the province of Harar. It was a test of position of power, but one that was closely watched by the ruling nobility. Some believed he was too young, too inexperienced, but they underestimated him. As governor, Tafari proved himself to be an exceptional leader. He modernized Harar's administration, built schools, reformed the economy, and strengthened the justice system. He became known for his intelligence, his patience, and his ability to balance tradition with progress. But his ambitions did not end in Harar. Tafari had a vision not just for himself, but for Ethiopia. He saw a country that could stand as an equal among the great nations of the world. A country that could modernize without losing its identity. And he knew that to make this vision a reality, he needed more than just a governorship. He needed the throne. In 1916, Emperor Menelik II had died, and the empire was thrown into uncertainty. His successor, Lige Iyasu, was seen as weak and unstable. Many nobles feared that Ethiopia would descend into chaos. Seeing his opportunity, Tafari allied himself with powerful figures in the court and helped orchestrate a coup to remove Lige Iyasu from power. With Lige Iyasu gone, Empress Zuditu, Menelik's daughter, was crowned ruler of Ethiopia. But everyone knew the truth: she was only empress in name. The real power rested with Tafari Makanin. He was now Rastafari, the de facto ruler of Ethiopia. But he did not intend to remain second in command forever. He had come from the shadows, he had climbed the ranks, and now only one obstacle stood between him and absolute power: the imperial crown itself. The boy from Harar was about to become king. Power is not inherited, it is seized. Rastafari Makanin had risen through the ranks of Ethiopian nobility with patience, intelligence, and political mastery. By 1916, he had positioned himself as the real power behind the throne of Empress Zuditu, the daughter of Menelik II. But Tafari did not settle for being second in command. He had one goal: the crown, and he was willing to wait, plan, and maneuver until the throne was his. While Empress Zuditu ruled in name, Tafari controlled the empire in practice. He was the one making key decisions. He was the one shaping Ethiopia's future. And unlike the conservative empress, Tafari saw the need for change. He envisioned a modern Ethiopian Ethiopia that could stand equal to the great nations of the world. His first move? Diplomacy. In 1923, Tafari achieved something no Ethiopian leader had done before he secured Ethiopia's entry into the League of Nations, the international organization meant to prevent global conflicts. This was a bold statement. Ethiopia was no longer an isolated empire. It was now recognized as a sovereign nation on the world stage. Tafari was sending a message: Ethiopia was not to be ignored. His international presence grew. He traveled to Europe, meeting with world leaders, observing modern governance, studying military tactics. In 1924, he toured the Middle East and Europe, securing diplomatic relations and strengthening Ethiopia's alliances. The young regent, once underestimated by the traditional nobility, was now being seen as the future of Ethiopia. But inside his own empire, enemies lurked. The nobility, deeply rooted in tradition, resented Tafari's modernization efforts. Many believed he was too aligned with the West, that his reforms were eroding Ethiopian culture. But Tafari was careful. He did not seek to erase tradition, only to adapt it. He expanded education, built roads, introduced new administrative systems. He was transforming Ethiopia from an ancient kingdom into a modern nation. But power is never secure. Empress Zuditu was still on the throne, and though she allowed Tafari to rule, her supporters in the court plotted against him. They saw his growing influence as a threat. In 1928, they attempted to sideline him by elevating him to the title of Negus King. This was a compromise, meant to satisfy his ambitions without making him emperor. But Tafari had no intention of stopping at king. 2 years later, the empress was dead. In 1930, Zuditu mysteriously fell ill and passed away. Some suspected foul play, others saw it as divine fate. Whatever the truth, her death removed the last obstacle in Tafari's path. And on the 2nd of November 1930, Rastafari Makanin was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia. His coronation was an event unlike any other. Dressed in robes of gold, seated beneath the grand crown of Ethiopia, he was declared King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. For his people, this was more than just a political event. It was a spiritual moment. Haile Selassie was not just a ruler, he was divine. His lineage was said to trace back to the legendary King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, making him not just a king but a messianic figure, chosen by God to lead his people. In the streets, the people bowed. In churches, his name was praised. To many, he was not just an emperor, he was the second coming of Christ. And beyond Ethiopia's borders, in a place he had never seen, his coronation would spark something even greater. In the Caribbean, a movement was rising. Among the poor and oppressed of Jamaica, Haile Selassie's coronation was seen as the fulfillment of prophecy. A new belief took root that Selassie was not just a king, but a living God, the one who would lead the African people to liberation. This was the birth of Rastafarianism. Haile Selassie was no longer just the ruler of Ethiopia. He was a global symbol of resistance, of freedom, of divine power. But even gods are tested. And across the sea, a storm was brewing. A storm in the shape of an empire. Italy was coming, and Haile Selassie's reign was about to face its greatest test. A ruler is only truly tested when war comes to his doorstep. For years, Emperor Haile Selassie had worked to modernize Ethiopia. He had strengthened its military, improved its infrastructure, and secured its place on the world stage. But across the sea, in Europe, a rising empire had its eyes set on his land, Italy. Decades earlier, Ethiopia had humiliated the Italians at the Battle of WWII in 1896, securing its status as one of the only African nations to resist European colonization. But Italy had never forgotten this defeat, and now, under the rule of Benito Mussolini, they wanted revenge. In 1935, the Italian army, armed with modern weaponry, tanks, and aircraft, launched a full-scale invasion of Ethiopia. It was a war of conquest, a war to expand Mussolini's fascist empire. The world watched, but no one intervened. And so Ethiopia stood alone. Haile Selassie was no fool. He knew that Ethiopia's military was outdated compared to Italy's modern war machine. But he would not surrender. He would fight. He mobilized his armies, calling upon the warriors of Ethiopia to defend their homeland. He knew that they did not have tanks, that they did not have air power, that they were fighting against an enemy with superior weapons. But they had something else, Will. The Ethiopian resistance was fierce. Using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and knowledge of the land, they slowed the Italian advance. But the Italians had no interest in fighting fair. In violation of international law, Mussolini's forces deployed poison gas, raining death upon Ethiopian villages. Thousands suffered, their bodies burned by chemical weapons, their lands poisoned. Italy used brutal tactics, massacres, bombings, executions, anything to break Ethiopian resistance. But still, Haile Selassie did not surrender. Then came the fall of Addis Ababa. In May 1936, after months of brutal fighting, the capital city fell to the Italians. Haile Selassie faced a choice: stay and fight to the death, or leave and fight another way. And so, for the first time in Ethiopian history, its emperor went into exile. But this was not defeat. This was strategy. Haile Selassie was not running away. He was preparing for the greatest battle of his life. His weapon? Not swords, not guns, but words. In June 1936, Haile Selassie did something no African ruler had ever done before. He stood before the League of Nations, the world's leading international body, and addressed its members in a speech that would be remembered for generations. His voice was calm, but his message was thunderous. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. He warned the world that if Ethiopia fell, other nations would follow. That fascism, left unchecked, would spread beyond Africa, beyond Europe, and engulf the world in flames. The room was silent. The world had never seen an African ruler stand before Europe's greatest powers and demand justice. He spoke of the crimes committed against his people, of the suffering inflicted by Mussolini's forces. He pleaded for help, but none came. The League of Nations, afraid of provoking Italy, did nothing. Ethiopia's cries for aid were met with empty words and broken promises. But Haile Selassie did not give up. He spent the next 5 years in exile, traveling across Europe, securing support, building alliances. He was not just a king, he was a symbol of African resistance, the face of anti-colonialism. And then, in 1941, everything changed. World War II had begun. The very nations that had ignored Ethiopia's pleas now found themselves fighting against the very fascism Haile Selassie had warned them about. Britain, now at war with Italy, saw an opportunity. They allied with Haile Selassie, providing him with an army, weapons, and a path to reclaim his throne. And Haile Selassie marched home. The Ethiopian resistance had never stopped fighting. In a coordinated assault, Ethiopian warriors, supported by British forces, launched a counteroffensive. The once invincible Italian army was pushed back, village by village, battle by battle. On May 5, 1941, after 5 years in exile, Haile Selassie entered Addis Ababa once again. He had returned. He had won. Ethiopia was free. The streets were filled with celebrations. The emperor had reclaimed his throne, and Ethiopia had become one of the first occupied nations in World War II to be liberated. Haile Selassie was at the height of his power. His name was legendary. He had not only saved his nation, he had proven that African sovereignty could not be erased. But wars are not only fought on the battlefield, and in the years to come, Haile Selassie would find that ruling in peace was far more difficult than ruling in war. The empire was secure, but his power? That was another story. Victory in war does not guarantee peace. Haile Selassie had reclaimed his throne. He had defeated the Italians, restored Ethiopia's sovereignty, and cemented his place in history. But the battles were not over. The war against an external enemy had been won, but now his greatest struggle would come from within. As Ethiopia entered a new era, the challenges of ruling a modern nation became clear. Haile Selassie was no longer a resistance leader fighting against colonialism. He was an emperor, responsible for leading a country into the future. And the future was changing. Ethiopia was a land of contrasts. On one side, there was traditional society built on ancient customs, a monarchy that had ruled for centuries, an empire that saw its rulers as divine. On the other, there was the New World, a rising wave of nationalism, democracy, and political movements sweeping across Africa. And in the middle of it all stood Haile Selassie, the last emperor in an era where kings were being dethroned, where monarchies were collapsing, where the world was moving towards change. The first signs of unrest. In the 1950s, Haile Selassie continued his modernization efforts. He expanded education, built new roads and hospitals, and pushed Ethiopia further onto the world stage. But progress came slowly. Many of his reforms benefited the elites, while the lower classes remained in poverty. Meanwhile, across Africa, something new was happening. Countries were rising against colonial rule. Independence movements were sweeping through the continent. Ghana, Kenya, Sudan, Nigeria all were breaking free. Ethiopia had never been colonized, but its people saw what was happening. They saw that nations were being reborn, that rulers were being challenged, that the world was shifting. And they began to ask if other nations could change. Why couldn't Ethiopia? The famine that changed everything. In 1972, a devastating famine struck northern Ethiopia. Crops failed, livestock died, entire communities were left without food, thousands starved. The world did not know. The government suppressed the information, refusing to acknowledge the full scale of the disaster. Aid was slow, resources were mismanaged, and the people, the very people who had once worshipped Haile Selassie, began to turn against him. In the streets, whispers became voices. Voices became protests. Protests became rebellion. The emperor had ruled for over 40 years, but his people had had enough. The fall of the Lion of Judah. By 1974, the unrest had reached its peak. Ethiopia's economy was collapsing, the military was growing restless, and revolutionary groups were rising in the shadows. The country was no longer loyal. And then, the unthinkable happened. On the 12th of September 1974, Haile Selassie, the God Emperor, the Lion of Judah, the last ruler of the Solomonic dynasty, was overthrown in a military coup. The very military that had once fought for him now stood against him. He was taken from his palace, stripped of his power, placed under house arrest. The monarchy was abolished, and Ethiopia was declared a socialist state under the control of the military junta known as the Derg. For the first time in centuries, Ethiopia had no king, no emperor, no divine ruler. Haile Selassie, once a god among men, was now just a prisoner. The last days of an emperor. He was held in confinement, isolated from the world. No grand palace, no court, no followers chanting his name. The man who had once addressed the League of Nations, who had stood against Mussolini, who had led Ethiopia for decades, was now locked away, a forgotten figure in his own empire. Then, in August 1975, the final chapter of his story was written. Haile Selassie was found dead in his palace. The official reports claimed he had died of respiratory failure, but many believed otherwise. Was he assassinated? Did the new regime silence him? Or was he simply a man whose time had run out? The truth remains unclear, but what is certain is this: his reign had ended, his empire had fallen, but his legacy had only just begun. The last emperor of Ethiopia was dead. The man who had once been hailed as a god, the ruler who had stood against Mussolini, the symbol of African sovereignty, was gone, but death is not the end of a legacy. It is the beginning of a legend. Haile Selassie's passing was shrouded in mystery. The official report stated he had died of natural causes respiratory failure at the age of 83. But few believed this. Many whispered that the new regime had silenced him permanently. that he had been strangled in his sleep, his death disguised to avoid public outrage. No grand funeral, no royal burial. His body was buried in secret beneath a palace floor, hidden from the world. A king who once ruled millions, now reduced to nothing. But emperors are not so easily forgotten. A divided memory. To some, Haile Selassie was the last great king of Africa leader who modernized Ethiopia, who defended its sovereignty, who stood against European colonization when the rest of the continent was being carved up by foreign powers. A hero, a visionary, a liberator. To others, he was a ruler who had stayed in power for too long. A monarch who resisted democratic change, who ruled with absolute authority, whose government had failed to protect its people from famine and poverty. A dictator, a symbol of stagnation, a fallen emperor. Which one was the truth? Or was the truth somewhere in between? The rise of a god. While Ethiopia's monarchy had fallen, Haile Selassie's name did not fade. In fact, his legacy took on a new form even he could not have predicted. To millions of people in the Caribbean, the Americas, and Africa, Haile Selassie was not just a man, he was a divine figure, a messiah, a god. In the 1930s, his coronation had been seen as the fulfillment of prophecy by followers of Rastafarianism, a spiritual movement that emerged in Jamaica. They believed that Selassie was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, the rightful ruler of Africa, and the leader who would bring liberation to black people across the world. Even after his death, this belief did not fade. His image, his speeches, his very name became sacred. Reggae music, led by artists like Bob Marley, carried his message across the world. His influence stretched beyond politics, beyond history, beyond Ethiopia itself. The emperor was dead, but the god remained. The return of the king. For decades, Haile Selassie's remains were hidden, his resting place unknown. But in 1992, nearly 2 decades after his death, his body was finally recovered. And in 2000, he was given a state funeral fit for an emperor. Thousands attended, paying tribute to a man whose legacy had outlived his reign. Today, his image still looms large. Statues stand in his honor, books are written about his rule, his speeches are studied, his words repeated. To some, he remains a symbol of African strength. To others, a warning about the dangers of absolute power. But whether seen as a hero or a tyrant, a god or a man, one thing is undeniable: Haile Selassie changed history. He ruled an empire, defied invaders, stood before world leaders, and inspired a movement that continues to this day. His reign ended, his kingdom fell, but his name will never be forgotten. The last emperor of Ethiopia was dead. The man who had once been hailed as a god, the ruler who had stood against Mussolini, the symbol of African sovereignty, was gone. But death is not the end of a legacy. It is the beginning of a legend. Haile Selassie's passing was shrouded in mystery. The official report stated he had died of natural causes respiratory failure at the age of 83. But few believed this. Many whispered that the new regime had silenced him permanently, that he had been strangled in his sleep, his death disguised to avoid public outrage. No grand funeral, no royal burial. His body was buried in secret beneath a palace floor, hidden from the world. A king who once ruled millions, now reduced to nothing. But emperors are not so easily forgotten. A divided memory. To some, Haile Selassie was the last great king of Africa leader who modernized Ethiopia, who defended its sovereignty, who stood against European colonization when the rest of the continent was being carved up by foreign powers. A hero, a visionary, a liberator. To others, he was a ruler who had stayed in power for too long. A monarch who resisted democratic change, who ruled with absolute authority, whose government had failed to protect its people from famine and poverty. A dictator, a symbol of stagnation, a fallen emperor. Which one was the truth? Or was the truth somewhere in between? The rise of a god. While Ethiopia's monarchy had fallen, Haile Selassie's name did not fade. In fact, his legacy took on a new form even he could not have predicted. To millions of people in the Caribbean, the Americas, and Africa, Haile Selassie was not just a man, he was a divine figure, a messiah, a god. In the 1930s, his coronation had been seen as the fulfillment of prophecy by followers of Rastafarianism, a spiritual movement that emerged in Jamaica. They believed that Selassie was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, the rightful ruler of Africa, and the leader who would bring liberation to black people across the world. Even after his death, this belief did not fade. His image, his speeches, his very name became sacred. Reggae music, led by artists like Bob Marley, carried his message across the world. His influence stretched beyond politics, beyond history, beyond Ethiopia itself. The emperor was dead, but the god remained. The return of the king. For decades, Haile Selassie's remains were hidden, his resting place unknown. But in 1992, nearly 2 decades after his death, his body was finally recovered. And in 2000, he was given a state funeral fit for an emperor. Thousands attended, paying tribute to a man whose legacy had outlived his reign. Today, his image still looms large. Statues stand in his honor, books are written about his rule, his speeches are studied, his words repeated. To some, he remains a symbol of African strength. To others, a warning about the dangers of absolute power. But whether seen as a hero or a tyrant, a god or a man, one thing is undeniable: Haile Selassie changed history. He ruled an empire, defied invaders, stood before world leaders, and inspired a movement that continues to this day. His reign ended, his kingdom fell, but his name will never be forgotten. History remembers its greatest leaders in many ways. Some are celebrated, some are condemned, and some are worshipped. Haile Selassie was all three. He was the last emperor of a dynasty that claimed descent from King Solomon, a ruler who modernized Ethiopia while holding on to absolute power, a king who fought against colonization, yet faced rebellion from his own people. To some, he was a liberator leader who stood before the League of Nations and warned the world about fascism before anyone else. To others, he was a Taranta monarch who failed to reform his government in time, who ruled while his people suffered. And to millions, he was something even greater: the living Messiah, the chosen one, the Lion of Judah. His name became sacred, his words became scripture, and his image spread across the world, carried by the voices of those who believed he had come to fulfill prophecy. But history does not give easy answers. Was Haile Selassie a hero, a visionary, a ruler who fought for his people? Or was he a king who refused to change, a man who held on to his throne until the very end, until the empire he built turned against him? What do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Because the story of Haile Selassie is not just about the past, it is about power, faith, and the way history chooses to remember its kings.